Many gardeners throw away used coffee grounds without realizing they may be missing one of the simplest ways to support healthier tomato and cucumber plants. I see this mistake every year. People spend money on fertilizers and special products while a free resource from their own kitchen ends up in the trash. The problem is not that their tomatoes and cucumbers cannot grow well. The problem is that the soil slowly loses life and the plants have to work harder than they should. When that happens, you often see weak growth, fewer flowers, smaller fruits, and plants that seem tired long before the season is over. What surprised me many years ago was discovering that something as simple as used coffee grounds could become part of a routine that helps support the soil and gives plants a better environment to grow in. I am not talking about miracles, and I am not talking about replacing good gardening habits. But I am talking about a simple method that costs almost nothing and can make a noticeable difference when used correctly. If you grow tomatoes or cucumbers and you want stronger plants, better flowering, and healthier soil, stay with me, because I want to show you exactly how I use used coffee grounds in my garden and why I still follow this old habit after all these years. When I first started gardening, I made the same mistake most people make. I thought plant food was all about buying something from a store. Every spring I would come home with bags and bottles of products promising bigger harvests and faster growth. Some worked a little. Some did almost nothing. Meanwhile, every morning I was throwing away coffee grounds without giving them a second thought. Then an older gardener showed me something that changed the way I looked at my garden. He told me that good gardening is often about feeding the soil first and the plants second. At the time, I did not pay much attention. But after watching his tomatoes grow thick stems and heavy clusters of fruit year after year, I started listening more carefully. He never wasted his used coffee grounds. Instead, he saved them in a bucket and added them around certain plants throughout the season. The results were not instant. That is important to understand. This is not one of those quick fixes. What I noticed was that his soil stayed darker, looser, and more active. His plants seemed stronger even during stressful weather. That simple observation made me start experimenting in my own garden. What happened over the next few seasons convinced me that this old method deserved a permanent place in my routine. And there is one detail that most gardeners completely overlook when they try it for the first time. That small detail is often the difference between success and disappointment. The detail I mentioned a moment ago is this. Most gardeners either use too much coffee grounds or they use them the wrong way. I learned that lesson the hard way. One year I got excited after seeing some good results and started dumping thick layers around my tomato plants. I thought if a little was good, then more had to be better. Within a few weeks, the soil surface became heavy and compacted. Water did not move through it the way I expected. The plants were not dying, but they certainly were not thriving either. That was when I understood that coffee grounds are not a complete fertilizer, and they are not something you should pile around plants in large amounts. They work best as a gentle support for the soil. Once I started using them properly, everything changed. Instead of creating a thick layer, I began sprinkling a small amount around the base of tomatoes and cucumbers and lightly mixing it into the top layer of soil. The difference was noticeable. The ground stayed softer. Earthworms became more common. Water soaked in more evenly. The plants seemed more comfortable during hot stretches of weather. That old gardener who first showed me the method smiled when I told him what happened. He said most people fail because they look for quick results instead of steady improvement. The more I gardened, the more I realized he was right. Good harvests are usually built from many small habits that work together over time. Coffee grounds became one of those habits for me. Another mistake I see all the time is people throwing fresh, wet coffee grounds directly around plants day after day without letting them dry first. I prefer collecting them in a bucket and allowing them to dry out before using them. It keeps everything cleaner and easier to spread. Sometimes I mix them with a little compost. Sometimes I combine them with dried leaves. That creates a simple blend that works beautifully around tomatoes and cucumbers. Very few people take that extra step, but it makes the whole process much easier. What I like most about this method is that it costs nothing. Every week, the average household produces a steady supply of coffee grounds. Instead of paying for another bag of garden products, you can recycle something you already have. For people trying to garden on a budget that matters. And for those of us who have been gardening for decades, there is something satisfying about turning kitchen waste into healthier plants. But the real benefit begins when you understand exactly where to place those grounds and when to apply them during the growing season, because timing plays a much bigger role than most gardeners realize. The timing is where this old method starts showing its value. Most people wait until their tomatoes or cucumbers look weak before they do anything. By then, the plants are already trying to recover from stress. I learned that it is much better to start early when the plants are healthy and actively growing. As soon as my tomato and cucumber seedlings settle into the garden and begin putting on new growth, I start using small amounts of dried coffee grounds. Nothing heavy, just a light handful spread around each plant and gently worked into the top inch of soil. That is all it takes. What happens next is not dramatic from one day to the next. You are not going to walk outside and suddenly find giant plants overnight. What you will notice over the following weeks is steady growth. The leaves stay rich and healthy looking. The plants develop stronger stems. The soil remains more alive and easier to work with. That is exactly what I want from any garden method. Slow, reliable improvement. One thing that impressed me over the years was how tomatoes seem to respond during flowering season. Every gardener knows that flowers are where the harvest begins. No flowers means no tomatoes. No flowers means no cucumbers. I started applying another light feeding of coffee grounds just before the plants entered heavy flowering. Again, I kept it simple. A small amount around the base followed by watering. Many gardeners ignore this stage and focus only on feeding after fruit appears. I prefer supporting the plant before that workload begins. It is a little like preparing for a long walk before you start climbing the hill. The plant enters the flowering period stronger and more prepared. I remember one summer when we had several weeks of heat and dry weather. Many gardens around me struggled. Flowers dropped from stressed plants and harvests were smaller than expected. My garden was not perfect, but the tomatoes and cucumbers held on surprisingly well. The soil stayed in better condition and retained moisture more evenly. That experience convinced me that coffee grounds are not just about feeding plants. They are also about helping create healthier soil that supports plants when conditions become difficult. Very few people think about that side of gardening. They focus only on what they can see above ground. The real story is often happening below the surface where roots are growing and soil life is working every day. And there is another old trick involving coffee grounds and compost that many gardeners have forgotten. When I started using it, my cucumber plants became noticeably more productive, and that is something I want to show you next. The old trick I mentioned is something I learned from a retired gardener who grew cucumbers that seemed to produce forever. Every time I visited his garden, there were fresh cucumbers hanging from the vines, and the plants looked healthy even late in the season. One day, I finally asked what he was doing differently. I expected some special fertilizer or expensive product. Instead, he pointed toward a simple compost pile behind his shed. That pile contained kitchen scraps, grass clippings, dry leaves, and a steady supply of used coffee grounds. He told me the coffee grounds were never the star of the show. Their real strength was how they helped improve the compost that eventually fed the garden. That idea stayed with me. Since then, I have saved a portion of my coffee grounds specifically for compost. The combination works beautifully. The compost becomes richer and more active over time. When that finished compost is spread around tomatoes and cucumbers, the plants seem to respond with stronger growth and healthier foliage. What I like about this method is that it stretches the value of something most people throw away. 1 cup of morning coffee becomes part of a system that feeds the garden months later. There's a certain satisfaction in that. Nothing is wasted, and the results continue season after season. Another simple step I follow is making a light coffee ground and compost blend during the growing season. I take several handfuls of finished compost and mix in a small amount of dried coffee grounds. Then I spread that mixture around the base of the plants. Tomatoes especially seem to appreciate this gentle feeding. The soil surface stays loose and dark. Water penetrates more evenly. When rain falls, it does not run off as quickly. During dry weather, that can make a noticeable difference. Cucumbers benefit too because they are fast growers that constantly need support from healthy soil. Most people focus entirely on what they add directly to the plant. They forget that roots spend their entire lives in the soil. Improve that environment and many other problems become easier to manage. One thing I noticed after several years was that the garden simply felt more balanced. The soil contained more worms. Digging became easier. The beds held moisture longer. The plants looked stronger without needing constant attention. That is why I still use this method today. It is simple, it is inexpensive, and it fits naturally into everyday life. But there is one mistake that causes many gardeners to give up on coffee grounds too soon. When that mistake happens, the plants often show signs of stress and people blame the coffee grounds when the real problem is something completely different. The mistake that causes most gardeners to abandon this method is expecting coffee grounds to solve every problem in the garden. I have seen it happen many times. Someone hears that coffee grounds can help tomatoes and cucumbers, so they start adding them everywhere. Then a plant begins turning yellow, or growth slows down and the coffee grounds get blamed immediately. In reality, the cause is usually something else entirely. Maybe the plant is not getting enough water. Maybe the soil is already compacted. Maybe there is a nutrient imbalance that started long before the coffee grounds were added. Gardening is rarely about one single thing. Healthy plants come from many small factors working together. Coffee grounds are just one piece of that puzzle. That is why I always tell people to think of them as a helper rather than a miracle solution. Another common mistake is applying coffee grounds too frequently. Some gardeners add fresh grounds every day because they drink coffee every day. Over time, that can create a heavy layer on the soil surface. I prefer collecting grounds for a week or two and then applying a small amount all at once. It keeps everything balanced and easy to manage. Less is often better. That lesson took me years to fully appreciate. One summer, I decided to compare two tomato plants growing side by side. One received moderate applications of coffee grounds mixed with compost. The other received much larger amounts because I wanted to see if it would grow even better. The result surprised me. The moderately treated plant looked healthier throughout the season and produced a more consistent harvest. The heavily treated plant struggled more during hot weather. Since then, I have always followed the rule of small amounts used regularly. Many older gardeners already know this instinctively. They understand that steady habits usually outperform extreme measures. There is another detail that very few people mention. Coffee grounds work best when the garden already has good basic care. Proper watering matters. Reasonable spacing between plants matters. Healthy soil matters. When those foundations are in place, coffee grounds become a useful addition rather than a desperate attempt to rescue struggling plants. I often tell new gardeners not to look for shortcuts. Look for simple habits that can be repeated year after year. This method fits perfectly into that philosophy. It costs almost nothing. It takes only a few minutes. And over time, the results begin adding up. The strongest proof for me has never been a single giant tomato or one unusually productive cucumber vine. The strongest proof has been seeing healthier gardens season after season. And the biggest reward appears near the end of summer, when the harvest begins to reveal what those small habits have been building all along. By the end of summer, this is where all those small decisions start paying you back. It never happens in one dramatic moment. Instead, you begin noticing little signs that tell the story. The tomato plants stay greener longer. The cucumber vines keep pushing out fresh growth when you would normally expect them to slow down. New flowers continue appearing. The soil remains easier to work with even after weeks of watering and hot weather. Those are the things I pay attention to now. Years ago, I only looked at the final harvest. Today, I watch the entire season, because healthy gardens leave clues long before the fruits are picked. One season stands out clearly in my memory. We had a difficult summer with several hot stretches and very little rain. Many gardeners around me were struggling to keep tomatoes productive. Some cucumber vines began fading early. I stayed with my usual routine: good watering, compost, moderate feeding, and regular use of dried coffee grounds around the plants. The garden was certainly not perfect, but it stayed productive much longer than I expected. By late summer, I was still carrying baskets of tomatoes into the kitchen and picking cucumbers every few days. That was when I truly understood the value of supporting the soil instead of constantly chasing quick fixes. Healthy soil gives plants a better chance when conditions become challenging. Another thing I appreciate is the sense of control this method provides. Gardening can sometimes feel expensive. Every year there seems to be a new product promising bigger harvests and better results. Coffee grounds remind me that some of the most useful garden resources are already sitting in our homes. Instead of throwing them away, we can put them back into the soil and allow them to become part of the growing cycle again. That feels practical and sensible. People over 50 often appreciate methods like this because they are simple and reliable. There is no complicated schedule to memorize, no expensive equipment to buy, just a small habit repeated over time. I know many gardeners who started saving coffee grounds for one season and never stopped because they liked how easy it was to fit into everyday life. The best part is that every cup of coffee becomes a reminder that you are also helping next month's tomatoes and cucumbers. It is a small connection between the kitchen and the garden that many people overlook. And when harvest season reaches its peak, there is one final lesson that this old method teaches. It has less to do with coffee grounds themselves and more to do with the way successful gardens are built year after year. That lesson is probably the most valuable thing I have learned in all my time. Growing vegetables. The most valuable lesson this old method teaches has very little to do with coffee grounds and everything to do with patience. After all these years in the garden, I have learned that the best harvests rarely come from expensive products or complicated systems. They come from simple habits repeated over and over again. A handful of coffee grounds saved from breakfast, a little compost added at the right time, consistent watering, a few minutes spent paying attention to the plants. These things seem small when you do them, but together they create something much bigger. That is why I still save coffee grounds today. Not because I believe they are magic, not because they instantly double a harvest. I use them because they are one more way to support the soil and help the garden stay productive naturally. When tomatoes begin filling out with healthy fruit and cucumber vines continue flowering deep into the season, I am reminded that small efforts really do matter. I also enjoy the fact that this method costs almost nothing. In a world where people are constantly encouraged to buy more products, it feels good to use something that would otherwise be thrown away. Every bucket of coffee grounds becomes another small investment in next month's harvest. That simple idea has served me well for many seasons. If you decide to try this method, remember to keep it simple. Dry the grounds. Use moderate amounts. Mix them lightly into the soil or combine them with compost. Give the plants time to respond. Watch what happens over the course of an entire season instead of looking for overnight results. Most gardeners who stick with it begin noticing healthier soil first. Then they notice stronger plants. Then they notice better flowering and steadier harvests. The changes arrive gradually, but they are real. When I walk through the garden now and see tomato plants heavy with fruit and cucumber vines still producing after months of growth, I often think back to that older gardener who first shared this idea with me. He was not trying to sell anything. He was simply passing along a practical habit that had worked for him for years. Now I am doing the same with you. And the next time you make a cup of coffee before heading out to the garden, do not be so quick to throw those grounds away. They may be the beginning of a healthier harvest than you expect. And there is another forgotten kitchen ingredient that many old gardeners quietly use around tomatoes and cucumbers, which surprises almost everyone the first time they hear about it.